Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to a video where we're going to do some motion analysis from opening opposition on the motion, this House believes that microfinance organizations such as charities, NGOs, development banks, etc. should offer microfinance loans in developing nations only to women. So what I'm going to do is first give you some framing, and this is going to be useful to just understand what this debate should be about and what this actually looks like in the real world, and also what burden pushing you can do from opening opposition to make it harder for government teams to take it over you. Then also, thirdly, why actually you're going to have maybe less successful projects if you implement this motion, and explaining why it's important. And then there's just lastly a loose point on why you're going to get more funding under our side of the house. That's opening opposition. So framing. So I want to explain two things. One, how these loans looks like, and two, how these countries look like in which you do microfinancing. So I think it's important to just have this clarity, specifically on the first line, because it is about what are these loans actually for. And I think at the moment you just look in real life, what we see is that this is for entrepreneurship. So this is about starting your own business. This is about, maybe expanding the business you already have, such as like a farm and making it better. But this is not about education, or it's not about healthcare costs or any of these things. And I think this is just empirically true, but I also want to give you maybe some intuitive reasons to try to convince you for this. I think this might be important when you get a POI on this, or when someone uses different framing, that you're able to explain that actually this isn't true. And I think this is important because the debate should not just happen in debate land, but it should be about real life, because this is about microfinancing that actually exists in the world right now. So why is it not then about healthcare? I think again, it is a loan that you want to have paid back. And it is very unsure that when they were unable to save up or to get some extra money from someone, that they would now be able to pay you back. So there's a higher risk in there. But there are also alternative charities who are able to solve the issue of healthcare. So there are NGOs which fund hospitals, which make it accessible for people to go to the hospitals in the first place. But there are also things such as Doctors Without Borders, who literally just give you free vaccines or free treatment for your issues, which means that those most likely are going to be perceived as filling that niche and not these loans. Secondly, for education, similar line. The thing with education is it's a bit unsure if you're going to be able to pay it off, because they don't know if you're going to succeed your university. They don't know how long you're going to take. They don't know what job you're going to get and what the job market is going to look like. And therefore, because they also want to show their success towards the people who have invested, it's unlikely for them to go for such a long-term project for over a relatively small-term project, which is just setting up a business where you can see that they have made revenue and therefore they are profitable. And also here, there are just other things which give you help with education. So there are projects which make sure that there are more traveling teachers within countries, and also trying to check that they are actually in the schools and giving the right classes. There are scholarships, which are not loans. There are just people who build education centers and then make admission like cheaper, all of the stuff. So again, they don't fill this niche, which is specifically about entrepreneurship. Okay. Secondly, they also already need to have some selection process. So this is just in real life. You need to show what the plan's going to look like. If you want to open a supermarket, which street is it going to be in? What building do you want to have? What do you think the costs are going to be like? What are you going to specifically invest in? What do you think your long-term money is going to be like? What's your short-term money going to be like? All of these things. And then they're going to select this. Again, there is some selection process, because there are going to be more people who want a loan than there is money for loans. Because again, this is not the only charity that exists. There are also a lot of other charities that exist that people give money to. So, and oftentimes these are also more poorer countries, which means there are just a lot of people who want these loans in the first place. So therefore, there is some capacity to actually make sure you get some good plans. So this is most likely what opening government is going to use to explain to you why these loans will be good. And this is why I'm saying this right now, because then you can actually preempt some of the analysis at the moment you go to build a case, which then tries to prove the opposite. Thirdly, I think this is important. Oftentimes, this is when people have also little to no credit history. So at the moment, people already have a credit history. This means that they oftentimes already have access to banks. Oftentimes also means that they're able to use collateral, such as their house, or they can show that, look, I've already paid off loans, which makes them more credible loaner, which is that oftentimes they already have other places and other avenues for them to get funding. And therefore, oftentimes these organizations are unwilling to give them the funding, because again, there are other people who need it more and they just have capacity to do it somewhere else. So I think this is maybe something that you can use on the opposition side more, where you'd be like, okay, but actually there's just very risky business anyway. I want to note that this is also symmetric. So if you're going to say we're going to fund projects on either side, then there's going to be no credit history for either side. But I think there's still a bit if you say like, look, but then there are other extraneous aspects you can look into, which then might determine it more. But I think this is important as a tactical note that it might also harm your own case, which is also something that you'd ask when you think of framing. And fourthly, this is not just about loans, but this is also about giving you help. So this looks like giving you some finance literacy. This looks like at the moment you have a crisis that you're able to have consultants who are able to explain to you, this is what you could do, this could help you, all of these things. Again, this is something that opening government is going to use to then explain why they're going to be successful. So at the moment, I'm going to explain the argument about why they're going to be successful. I'm going to come back to these 2 points and how you can either mitigate them or how you can argue against them. Now, on to countries. I think it's important to note that if you look empirically, the countries where this happens the most is, I think, India, Bangladesh, Ecuador, Congo, I think also Indonesia, and these kind of places. Um, and this is just empirically true. So this is not necessarily about, for example, Balkan countries. This is not necessarily true for a lot of, what's it called, like sub-Saharan African countries. This tends to be more about the South Asian countries. There's just an empirical fact that I know. There's not really a structural reason that I can give for this. But I think this is maybe just interesting for you to know, and maybe also make interesting people like you can ask. But why is this important in which countries this takes place? Not just because it's about the real world, but also influences the way you're going to make argument, right? Because at the moment that these are kind of like the countries, you can explain that most likely they are already going to be more on the sexist side. And you can also explain to what extent they are sexist and to what extent they throw barriers for women to start their own business. I think again, this is able to highlight why it's going to be harder for them to maybe succeed. But I also want to know that you can just make some general arguments on why the upward social momentum might also be hard in these locations. So at the moment, you're going to have India, for example, then there's a caste system there, which means it's already going to be harder for them to be accepted by other people with a higher socioeconomic class, but also the narratives that exist within these castes are going to be pushing them more away from it. I think this is an interesting way that you can then use this and explain why there might be extra barriers, and also specifically on women, that makes it even harder for them to exist, or for them to create businesses that exist, to be explicit. So having understood the basic framing of how these microloans actually look like, and how this can then help both government opposition side, what are the things that you can actually do from opening opposition to create more burdens for your government side? Because I want to know that this house believes it's actually by motion, and in this motion you have counter fiat, or like you have fiat for counter prop, so you can just have a counter model. So I think this is just like an easy one, and it's kind of like a bit annoying, but you say, why would you need to have all the funding go? You can say, look, we can have a 70-30% split. We can have a 50-50% split, where 50% is going to be funding that's just going to go to women inherently. And then the other one is going to be meritocratic. You can say we're going to have some blind selection there. It doesn't necessarily need to go to membership, like some form of meritocracy. And therefore, we're going to select the best projects. Then you can also just say, look, there are also other minorities that exist that might need this help. So these are ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and queer minorities. And we can also just put funding for them. Now, I want to note that there is actually another burden in this argument, right? Or in this argument, if you're going to say we're going to help other minorities. That is to say, you need to explain why giving funding to women comes at a trade-off for giving money to these ethnic and religious minorities. And I think this is the most contentious part of this argument, because I think government might say, but then you can just give it to women who are part of these minorities, and then you can still have the same benefits. I think that you could say that one, if you want to have these role model things where you see like, you see people succeed like you, it is also still important for men to have these from these religious minorities. So again, you see a Muslim man or a Sikh man actually succeed in India. But you can also say that sometimes it's impossible. So for queer people, this is kind of like intuitive, right? Where you can say like, if you are, for example, a trans man, or if you are a male homosexual, that you don't feel represented by, for example, a female homosexual having a good business. But I think that there are other ways to maybe explain this link, where you can say, look, at the moment that these people they are part of a community which already marginalized, means it's harder for them to perceive that they're going to be able to succeed because they have this barrier of being part of that specific minority. So being, for example, Muslim or being being from a specific tribe. At that point, it becomes harder for them to have networks outside. But oftentimes also internally, there's still quite some social structures, which makes specifically more difficult for women. So again, you can give some intuitive reasons, which is at the moment, for example, men or feel marginalized in their community, they might want to have some power within like their own local community, which means they oftentimes go harder on gender roles and they go harder on what women can and cannot do. But also you can say they're also, because they are a bit more insular, they oftentimes also have a bit more conservative values because they oftentimes go back to a history that they share or important values from the past, which has differentiated them from the society they are part of, which means that oftentimes they are having even more restrictive perceptions of what women should do. Therefore, it is very difficult for women to get funding or to even get to the point where they have a good enough business plan that they're going to get the funding, but also for them to believe that they should get the funding, which means there's going to be a higher selection process. And therefore, it is better to actually give men than this funding because then uplifts that community. This is some way to argue this. I think there might be some better mechanizations here or some other things. This may be a way that you create a path to victory just on these minorities itself, because they say, look, at the moment, opening government says there are benefits, such as helping women as a whole, or having them feel represented, or creating role models, and therefore people feel like they're able to overcome barriers. And you can say this is also important for other minorities. They never explained why this is going to be the most important thing to only help women in these contexts. Thirdly, this is just marginalization. So let's say opening government is going to run for the case, this creates more healthcare centers, or this creates more education centers, which can also become accessible for women. You can say, look, in the status quo, when you give this funding, already there are requirements for it to be accessible for women. So you can say this actually in status quo, at the moment you're going to have an education system to be created. Women should have access to it anyway. I think you can say this is true for intuitive reasons, but you can also say this is true for fiat reasons, which is going to fiat this in. This is not that hard of a burden to go for. It's not that much like, oh, you also just need to accept women, and then that's it. It doesn't cost that much, political and economic fiat to implement that. But the intuitive reason why this is already true is oftentimes the moment that you just have a marginalized group, it is easy to then show them to actually make progress in, for example, education. And therefore, it is something that these charities can actually point to at the moment they want to show why they're good. But also, again, charities are made from people who want to do good. And at the moment they see a marginalized group which does not have access to education, and they literally have the capacity to solve this by just making the projects also accessible for women, or just having that one requirement, then clearly they're going to do that because they just want to help people. That's why they are in the charity business. So this is just, again, marginalizations get why maybe you create now new businesses or new projects that also are accessible for women. Now, I think here, the last thing as well that you can do is country setting, because opening government and government budgets as a whole need to explain why there is a problem, why barriers exist, and why there's barriers that require you to extra funding. And then still to explain why actually this extra funding is going to lead you to actually going to be able to overcome all those barriers. So at the moment they say that actually there's just a lot of problems and they just highlight themselves. You guys be like, you don't overcome all of these problems, so they're still very likely for you to fail as a business. But you can also say that if they use more like smaller mechanization of why you have problems, you say like, you have just implicit biases, and that's why you have a lot of problems where you don't give the funding to the man and all this stuff. You can say, well, no, these societies are significantly more conservative. Because they are more conservative, there are actually more problems. I also want to know that if they go for the more implicit analysis, then the counter problems like, we're going to do blind testing, or we're going to have like the plants being built in, and then you can't say if you are a man or woman, that kind of stuff. Maybe just look at the plants themselves. All of this stuff is a way to mitigate this. But then again, if you're going to make arguments about why men necessarily will succeed more because of their context and all of the stuff, that might become harder for you to make this point, because then it is blind, so you can really account for that. I think you can still frame why you can. So you can say you still need to like maybe say, I have these connections, or you can look at the education part and say like, I have better education, all these things. But I think again, it's important to highlight that if you try to mitigate opening government too much, you might mitigate your own case. So I think it might be more tactical to be like, look, we can have some counterbalances against this, maybe some processes being, blind, but we're also fine if this is not the case, and then you just give the reasons why they might succeed. So this is kind of like some tactical moves that you can do on word pushing, which might make it harder for opening government to win. So why do you then fund less successful projects? I think you can give two kind of reasons, or I'm going to highlight these. First one is basically this is just you have the most risky female entrepreneurs, which are like the lower 50% who wouldn't get funding otherwise, versus the safest 50% of male entrepreneurs. And therefore, you just have better businesses. I think I want to note that there's an implicit burden here, which is that you need to explain that some form of meritocracy is possible. Because by opening government frames it says, oftentimes you don't know beforehand if a business will succeed, all of this stuff. Therefore, it's very difficult to actually, make a meritocratic thing anyway. I think you can say, look, there are still very clear metrics on which we can determine the likelihood of you succeeding. So at the moment that you already have better education or you already have, more experience in a sector, that means that you already have better knowledge on how the sector looks like, what it kind of like requires. If you have different internships, it also show a form of adaptability, all of the stuff, and you can then explain where there are metrics on which you're able to determine meritocratically where you're going to give this funding. Now, the second thing is the sexist problem analysis. So I think that again, you get to say if OG doesn't sell, so you can just point to it. I want to maybe highlight a couple of reasons just so you can, use these as they just maybe might do a bit more implicit bias analysis. So I think you could say, look, at the moment you just have less education and less capacity to network. This just means that it's going to be harder for you to get access to maybe cheaper contracts because if you're buddy with someone, they're often going to give you a better deal. Or at the moment you have less education, you might not foresee other problems, or you might not know the most cost efficient way to do something, or you might lack some expertise on your specific field. I want to note that opening government does have some analysis here or some like frame that they can do, which is, we can give you some financial literacy and we can give you some help. And I think you can say, look, this is actually just giving you almost to the same extent as other businesses have, which have, for example, a business education, or for example, have already other stuff, but also they have networking, which is a unique benefit. So it's actually not going to give you extra information, it's going to give you the basic information. Because again, if the framing is you already have a lower like social security and if you and a social lower credit score, then most likely you're not going to be part of like very highly educated people because this most likely already have access to banks and they don't give loans to these. So therefore, you could be like actually it becomes quite hard for you to get extra information. So this is how you deal with that specific framing. You can also just say that when there's going to be less trust in them, and this is where you have these social narratives and all these kinds of stuff that you can highlight where, religiously, maybe they're always seen as they always need to care for the family, or biologically, they're seen as like not as rational, all of these kinds of things. Then at the moment that you are trading with this company, then you are less likely to say like, okay, we're fine with you, for example, paying later the rest of the money. No, you want to have all the money upfront because they believe that you're going to fail. Same with the people who are going to be working in your sector, right? So at the moment that they feel like your company is riskier, then the better workers are going to go towards other companies that they perceive as going to be better, therefore, or more secure. Therefore, you're much more likely to have less qualified workers. And another thing is like a boycott. So I think you can say it's like an active boycott, and so it's like, oh, we're going to not go to these women shops. But I think that maybe a more nuanced way is that more of like a sub boycott. So when you now go to, for example, a clothing shop, for example, and you say like, oh, a woman is running this, so most likely the materials that she has chosen are not as good. Or I don't trust her. I think that she's going to screw us over and going to let's overpay. Therefore, I'm going to go to another shop. Then that might actually mean that you also have less clientele who are willing to go to your business. Then again, maybe opening government is going to say, but you have specifically women that you cater to, so you have a market here. They say, look, if they are oftentimes more sex societies, then oftentimes they don't have that money or they depend on the husband for the money. And if the husband doesn't want them to go to the shops, it becomes harder for them to then, actually cater to these groups. So you can also say there's just a low demand for these projects. So I think this kind of like deals with the framing that we had. So let's just go back, right? So you can say like, it kind of like includes educational help. It's like, okay, but yeah, it's only to the level at which that your other businesses already have. At best, it might even still be worse. But also, secondly, you need to give business plans, like, sure. But if there are other structural things that even if you have a good business plan, it doesn't mean that people don't boycott you. It doesn't mean that people still feel like you are the worst company to go work for and therefore they're unwilling to work for you. So therefore, you can say it becomes harder for them to actually succeed. Okay, now you basically then say, then this means that these projects are likely to fail or are more likely to fail. Now, it's still important to explain why this is important and why this outweighs any benefits that opening government might bring. So if you have a really good opening government, then they're going to talk about how this creates like role models, how this creates a capacity for them to, go away from oppressive structures. They're going away from their husbands. They have more financial stability, or just at least have greater capacity to try to choose their own career, even if it's just for a short term. Now, how do you say this? How do you deal with this? The first one is just flipping the point, right? Because if the thing is you have good role models if they succeed, then you could say, well, if they fail, then actually you're going to have negative stereotypes enforced, right? Because they got all this money and they got all this education via OG's framing, and now they're suddenly failing, then that means like you feel as a woman trapped in a system that you can't get out of. And that is way more depressing. And therefore they're actually much more likely to fall back. Therefore, it's better to focus on projects that are more likely to succeed, because at that point you actually have those positive things which are going to make people feel moralized and get out. Then you don't have the possible thing where you have these stories failing and people feeling demoralized. And then you can also say like that it is going to be very likely that at the moment you have these failing projects, that they're also going to be in the media where they're going to say, oh, look at these failed businesses, all of these stuff, where maybe politicians are going to use this to polarize people, all of these things. So therefore, you're also able to, use negatively enforce this to kind of like continue these social narratives like that women shouldn't do these things. Also, you can just say that there are sometimes projects that just need to happen. So at the moment, you, for example, have a village where there are some farmers, but they just have a lot of problems with droughts. Then you can say that there might be sometimes people who just happen to be men who are better able to create these systems, And I think you can say maybe it is that they're just more believed by these farmers. Therefore, they don't need to continuously fight with these people to make sure that they accept these technologies. But also, you could say maybe there's just no woman who's willing to just go through all of that work. Maybe they just have other stuff they need to focus on, or they don't want to go through the mental load of just trying to convince all these people and just go through all this stuff. But these projects are still very important because the moment you have drought resistant farms, that basically means you're going to have less people, starving to death is just like a very large impact. But you could say less people getting malnourished. It is more secure that their kids are able to develop well and don't have health problems in the long term because they didn't have enough food that they have during their childhood, all of this stuff. But I also think you can just say that these good projects will trickle down. So you can say at the moment that you just have, for example, better businesses who have a more stable source of income, and you also have stable jobs. This means that families are also better off. So at the moment you have more money, there's more food on the table, you have better education that you can give to your kids. This means that people are able to not live in poverty. And you can say the thing is as well that oftentimes when a family, for example, has economic problems, the woman is more likely to give up more of this. So at the moment there is a lack of food, then the food should then go to the man because the man needs to work more and needs to earn the money. And therefore it is more likely for the woman to get malnourished. So in these cases, it's also important to actually make sure that you have these projects succeed, because this also will indirectly lift up women, but also in general, it is just a good thing that will happen. And therefore it's important to go through these projects. And the last thing is just funding, right? So at the moment you have more success on the arts at the house. And this is what we had beforehand. And you have this amount of projects succeeding, and then you implement this plan, then it becomes this percent. Then less people are actually willing to fund it because they don't see it as effective, which means that they're much more likely to go for projects which are more proximate to them. So they're like, oh, we as the government are not going to give you this grant because you're less effective. We're going to use this for women in our own country to solve their issues or something like that. And then you can explain, well, even though you help maybe women in developed nations, these are less important than actually helping people in developing nations. And again, here you can also use the counterprop, which is, look, at the moment that they're also just good projects from other minorities, which then don't help. We're actually able to, that's maybe also more positive impact than having these negative stereotypes for the women that have failed. So yeah, therefore you can say overall it's more likely for them to fail, and this is how you then weigh against this clash. Let's then quickly go on to the last clash. So the way this last clash works, basically say you're going to get less funding. And I think that you could just say this is important because, again, having projects that are good are just good for everyone, because it just means that people just have jobs, people just have more funding. But also you can say, look, at the moment you have an increase in funding. This also means that women in the end get more funding. If like the margin between the projects, like the 50-50%, then is overcome by having like, I don't know, 160%. increase of funding or not having a decrease of funding in that way. Might be a hard burden to prove at the moment. It's going to be 50-50, but I think you can still say, look, again, if there's a trickle down for it still might help women if you just have good businesses, or when you're just going to be able to have more money, this is going to be prior to actually helping these women in the first place. So how do you then explain you're going to get less funding on the government side of the house? So I think you can just say that there's a strong pivot from going to meritocratic, or people perceive as meritocratic, to then only going to go towards women. And I think you can say, look, feminists will donate anyway, right? Because you still have projects which explicitly state that women should have access to education. They're still like 50 or 60% at least going to women, right? So at the moment they still have good projects and they beat other men, they still get extra funding from these other parts. So clearly you can just say like, oh, look, we're helping women. So feminists are likely to donate the money anyway. Then the other stuff you can say is there's basically then going to be polarization, where there are going to be groups who are not going to give you money. I think you can talk about two groups who might polarize: people in the West and people in the countries where you have these fundings. So for polarization in the West, I think you can say, look, clearly there's a culture going on. So at the moment you look at South American states, or Southern states in America, then they're having like they're throwing a hissy fit over the fact that there are gay people in children's books, and this is kind of like indoctrinations. And you can also maybe have other intuitive analysis, like, look, if you look at YouTube, there are all the videos like, oh, cringe feminist gets destroyed by Ben Shapiro, all of this stuff. And we just see that this culture war exists. And at the moment, you suddenly strongly pivot away from what you're doing right now. And you're going to go for all women. This is going to go perceived as a more radical shift, never going to be associated with these radical feminists that people, like making fun of. But also this becomes more possible for politicians to then harp onto this and be like, oh, look, wokeism has gone too far. If you go woke, you go broke, all of this stuff. And therefore, they're much more likely to protest these organizations. They're much more likely to give less funding to these organizations via government grants, all of this stuff. Whereas in the status quo, if we look at it right now, no one is really talking about microloans. No one is really talking about, giving them less money in status quo. So therefore, there's just going to be a decrease in the moment you're going to do this. I think you could just say something similar within these developing countries. Maybe less of the culture war analysis, but I think you can just definitely say, look, it's very easy for politicians to say like, oh, you're going to create your possible funding that you could have gotten as men, but now they're going to only give it away to women. And then also then play into these stereotypes like, oh, actually, women aren't successful. Look at all these projects that have actually failed. That could have been your project that could have got the money anyway, and all this stuff. And I think that you can just say that this leads to maybe protest. This may lead to a pocket of people radicalizing, and that might lead to actual harm, right? So at the moment you have some people getting swept up into this, and it's a very nice narrative that most people are somewhat poor already. Then they're going to be like, okay, we're going to maybe like throw in the windows of this shop that's run by women, and therefore it even becomes harder for them to exist because again they have this extra cost. But also then you have the problem of the clientele, which makes them less profitable and make them more controversial. I want to note that this is maybe a bit of a higher burden case, right? Because you need to explain why it's going to be a lot of less funding and why it's going to be important. Why do I think it's still useful for opening opposition to bring? I think firstly, this is a turf-burning matter, and says that if closing opposition tries to run this point, which you already have some analysis, it means that they need to do weighing against not only the analysis that you have, but also the other cases you've already proved, which is the first thing. But also I think government side might just go for, you get more funding because now these local governments are going to pivot more towards actually helping women because they want to have this extra money. Or you can say, you're going to have more feminist funding because people care about women, but they don't care about developing nations in of themselves because there's some level of guilt that they have at the moment that they see that the Western countries have really just extracted a lot of resources from these countries because of colonialism. And therefore it just has a sense of shame of it and therefore they're willing to give money. At the moment you have at least competing analysis of this. It means that these teams need to have a higher burden of actually proving their specific case. And even if you don't have time to bring this in the LO or DLO, I think this is some rebuttals you can bring to possible cases. But I also think that this is good POIs that you can ask about why you might get less funding against a closing team, which might have an analysis where you get more funding. So maybe just to do a bit of a recap. So we framed how these loans look like. So these are most likely just going to be entrepreneurship loans, where it's going to be some requirements for you to actually have good plans. But there are also going to be quite some forces that makes it that these people are going to have a lot of trouble actually succeeding, either via the fact that they still are not as educated as maybe other competitors, but also the fact that they might have specific extra barriers because they are women owning these businesses. Then you could also say that this is specifically because of the country that they're in. The more conservative they are, the harder it is to overcome these barriers. And then there are just good projects that need to happen. And if there just happens to be a man who is only willing to do the job, we should give the person that job. And you can also then again do some likelihood analysis why it's likely that again women are unwilling or unable to actually do these projects, either because of cultural issues or because of other issues. And then you can just say that these projects should happen and then outweigh them against any possible benefits, as well as saying that there's a harm when they don't succeed. And lastly, you can also just have a case about why you get less funding, why this will be, very controversial, specifically in the West, but also in these countries, which means they're going to be, less funding going towards these kind of charities, and therefore that might be worse off because then you have less funding directly to these communities, which oftentimes are a very effective way to helping people because at least then there's money in the economy, so people can just buy goods, they can just buy food, they can buy clothes and all this stuff. Yeah, this is not as extensive as maybe just doing the whole nest with all government side by side, but I think it's just a good, relatively short video on why this is going to, be a bad policy, and therefore that USOO can actually win this debate in this specific way. I hope this is clear. Next video will be the workshop that Ruben and I did on how to be a good CA. And yeah, I hope that this was clear. And if you have any questions, put it in the comments, and then I'll see you in the next video.